The nation is mourning a president today whose legacy, like everybody's, is complex. For many, he represented a bygone era of American politics and the Republican Party. President George Herbert Walker Bush died on Saturday at 94 years old after a years-long battle with Parkinson's. His body was brought to the Capitol Rotunda this afternoon, where he'll lie in state until a funeral Wednesday morning at the National Cathedral. And at this weekend's G20 summit in Argentina, Donald Trump spoke fondly of his predecessor.
He was a very fine man. I met him on numerous occasions. He was just a high-quality man who truly loved his family.
A family that frequently clashed with President Trump and refused to invite him to First Lady Barbara Bush's funeral in April, although Trump will attend Bush Sr.'s state funeral on Wednesday. That's because the late president, who once called Trump a blowhard, expressly ordered that he be invited. It's a gesture of respect that further sets apart the two commanders-in-chief, whose styles of leadership could not be more different, especially when it comes to foreign policy. As you may know, Bush served as ambassador to the UN, director of the CIA, congressman from Texas, and of course, vice president. And as Obama recently put it, he deserves enormous credit for navigating the end of the Cold War in a way that could have gone sideways. But as America discussed Bush's history this weekend, Donald Trump was reportedly engaging pleasantries with Russian President Vladimir Putin and Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, two leaders who appear to be having a really good time in Argentina over the weekend. But perhaps where Trump and Bush disagree most are on issues of tone and civility.
Just because you run against someone does not mean you have to be enemies. Politics does not have to be mean and ugly.
A sentiment lost on Donald Trump. Joining me to discuss are two former chairs of the Massachusetts Republican Party. Jim Rappaport is now director at the New Boston Fund. Good to see you, Jim. Jennifer Nassour is now CEO of Reflect Us. It's a bipartisan, female-focused political organization. Hi, Jennifer. We're also joined by Bob Hedlund, former Republican state senator. He is now the mayor of Weymouth. Mayor, it's good to see you. Can we get on the list quickly? First thoughts when you heard that President Bush had died. You knew him, Jim Rappaport. What did you think of?
I met him back in the late 70s, and he was always a gentleman, and whoever was with him at that time was the most important person in the world. Was it you rode on Air Force One with him? Was that what your experience was then? Absolutely. I mean, it's just funny, the picture of me is me talking to him, and he's listening intently. 33 years old, I probably could have done the reverse and listened to him a little bit more. What was your first memory when you heard about this over the weekend?
So I was actually in high school when he was first elected, and all I remember is watching him while he was vice president and while he was president as just this nice, gentle, kind man. And just, I was sad because I felt almost like a grandfather had died. How about you? We have a picture of you with him, and is it Ken Bunkport? Is that right?
Well, I thought of three things that come much earlier than that.
Okay,
first, I had the vision of him in the picture with Babe Ruth when he was the Yale baseball captain, which is the image that I always have of him. The military photo of him that they had for some reason, they got military footage of him when he was rescued by the submarine, when his plane was shot down. And I also thought about the first campaign I ever worked in, which I actually worked against him in the 1980 Republican presidential primary campaign. And having met him back when I was a teenager at that time, too. I was actually nonplussed meeting him and Reagan because I was supporting someone else who got less than 2% in that race. That's your kind of thing, isn't it? Well, it was me and Bill Weld, actually, at the time. What were we doing with him in Maine? What was the picture? Well, ironically, a family member of mine met a family member of his in New York. They ended up dating, marrying, and the first time I met him was at the wedding, which that's the picture of the wedding. Subsequent christening. Great. There's a funny story behind that. I don't know how much time we have, but he was a character. Give us 10 seconds of it. Actually, at the christening, he spotted me. I don't think he remembered me, but he was looking at my then lady friend and walked directly across the field to her and said, "Young lady, I just want you to know you're in the running for the Most Beautiful Woman of the Day award." And she said, "Thank you, Mr. President." And then when the ceremony got over, 45 minutes, an hour later, and everyone was breaking up, we kind of hung around, we're loitering, seeing how the other half lives. And he walked back across the field this time with Barbara, and he said, "Young lady, I just want you to know the results are in and you won." And she looked at him and said, "Oh, no, Mr. President, she won," and pointed at Barbara. And he looked at Barbara, he looked at her, he said, "No, you won," and Barbara gave him a smack. So, Jennifer, no, she said, I'm sorry, she said, she came in second. Is it fair to say that President Bush is being judged today in these last few days, not just on what he was, but on what
President Trump is not. I mean, it's being seen through that
yeah,
prism.
I mean,
is it
it's
not?
kind of tough not to do that, right? Because you see this man who held himself with such honor. He was the head of a political dynasty, though he didn't know it at the time, but everything that we've seen since then, in charge of the Gulf War, which he made seem seamless, you know, the whole, you know, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe issues. And so I think when you look at that and how gracious he seemed to handle everything, as opposed to today, where everything seems so nasty and harsh, and politics seems exactly contrary to what he had said.
And by the way,
back in
George
2009.
H.W. Bush voted for Hillary Clinton, we should say, in the last election.
And I would also say to you, one of the things that President Bush did was he exemplified what a former president should do in his behavior and the way he should give respect and deference to the following presidents, which our last 3 Democratic presidents, none of which have done.
Well, I would disagree with that. Barack Obama, until very recently, has said virtually no
I will
word.
say until very recently, but then he's done it. And to his credit, Clinton did not do a lot of speaking ill of George H.
I want to follow up on the civility thing. And the thing that most people are citing is this beautiful letter he left for Bill Clinton. We'll just read one line from this because you've all seen it ad nauseum over the weekend. You'll be our president when you read this note, obviously to the man who beat him. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success now is our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you. It's totally beautiful. But I thought Adrian Walker nailed it in the Globe today. How pathetic that in 2018 we have to praise a former president of the United States because he acted like a decent, civil human being. Adrian has a point, does he not?
You know, I think people, you know, I would rather look at his life as it was and the contribution he made and the great civil servant he was for the better part of 50 years than focus on those kinds of judgment engaging. I'm just not sure we accomplish anything with it.
Well, then you really won't like what I want to bring up now is, while the civility side I totally buy into. I never met him, but obviously I read a lot about him. I thought one of the low points in American politics in my lifetime was the Willie Horton ad that came out that even Lee Atwater, who was the maker of the ad, apologized for on his deathbed. And President Bush never apologized for it.
Well, first of all, that's the way the press makes history. The original Willie Horton ad, which actually had a black person in it, was made by a guy named Al Gore.
That's totally untrue.
It is true.
There's no picture of this. It's not true. I've seen it too.
And the so-called Horton ad, it was a revolving door, and there were no black people. It was just prisoners going in and out of jail.
First of all, with all due respect, Jim, you were wrong. One, his photograph was not in it. Two,
no, not a photograph. It was a black
Bush,
person.
the president, Bush never apologized for it. And three, President Bush's follow-up ad, which was not paid for by a political action committee, did have that revolving door. So let me try to do that again. I mean, that changed American politics. I mean, it led to, like, for example, you don't think it did?
No,
I don't think it changed American.
I
think we've always had negative campaigning, and Bush acknowledged, President Bush acknowledged that he could throw sharp elbows in campaigns, and he talked about that later in his life. And I don't know if he apologized, Jim.
No, I know that he did not apologize.
But he did talk about the distinction between how he ran campaigns and how he wanted to govern, and have that civility in governing. And he did acknowledge that he could throw an elbow in a campaign, and I think that's what you're, you know.
Does that trouble? I mean, apparently, it doesn't trouble the two gentlemen on both sides of you. This Willie Horton thing, which again, I know I'm hyperbolic. I would say was one of the lowest moments in presidential politics, at least in my lifetime.
I don't really remember it from the time, but I've seen it.
And by the way, many people believe, including me, it gave birth to this nauseating ad by Donald Trump a couple of weeks ago about the undocumented man who killed 2 law enforcement people, a variation on a theme, at least in my estimation.
Yeah, I don't know if we can look back on Bush and say that anything Donald Trump does not come from anyone else. It comes from Donald Trump.
I'm just saying that I think it was
yeah, I mean, I think that
American
American politics and campaigns are tough and rough, and sometimes you get bad advice. And as someone who has worked with candidates, as someone who's been a candidate, you know that sometimes the people around you have you do things that maybe you're not really into doing, and you do it, and then you regret it, and that's just the way it is.
Would there be a place for this President Bush? I mean, obviously it was a different time, but a president with those values in this Republican Party in 2018?
I wish, but currently the Republican Party is not the Republican Party, it's the party of Donald Trump. So when the Republican Party actually finds its way back to its core values, then yes, there would be a place.
Is there a place now, Jim Rappaport, for a George H.W. Bush?
I would suggest to you that there are significant numbers of senators and governors in this country who represent those kind of values. And whether or not, we obviously, many of us do not think that President Trump has the level of civility that we would like him to have, but there are lots of senators and there are, lots of Republican governors who exemplify that.
The thing that everybody remembers, of course, read my lips, no new taxes, and you're an anti-tax kind of guy. But if I
can tell you, it cost in my election. It cost me 10 points, and it cost on October 6th when that bill was passed and signed into bill, and it was pushed by Baker. There were 10 Republican challengers.
James Baker, obviously, right?
Yeah. Thank you, James Baker. There were 12 out of the 12 Republican challengers. 10 of them within 5 points.
But even if there was obviously a political cost, I should say, for President Bush.
That's why he lost in '92.
But I have to say, I'm trying to think which candidate, which elected official in 2018 America could make a pledge so central to his campaign and then decide it was important enough for the country, even if you think he was wrong, to essentially do a 180. I'm having a hard time finding one. Can you?
But we're losing a little historical context, because I think we were having the same discussion in 1980 in that George Bush represented the establishment wing, Ronald Reagan represented the Goldwater, New Right, and we were having that same discussion then. And
yeah, but I'm not talking about what position he took. I'm talking about the fact that he had the courage to basically say, I was right then, but I'm wrong for now, and I'm willing, I mean, he didn't use these words, I'm willing to pay a price for this because this is what this country needs, no?
You never know. We may be looking back someday at Donald Trump, and he's going to be saying, yeah, I was wrong about this, I was wrong about that, and be receiving accolades later in life like now. There's a lot of people that were critical of George Herbert Walker Bush that are now throwing plaudits his way in the context that we find ourselves by contrasting him to Trump.
It was the same with McCain. I mean, the same people who crucified him on a regular basis, and when he ran for president, all of a sudden thought he was a saint when he died.
Am I on the wrong path, though, with this flip by George H.W. Bush? And I like to think that even if he had done something in the other direction, in American politics where almost no one is ever to admit that the position they took yesterday is not the correct position today, deserves praise.
On either side. On either side. I don't think Nancy Pelosi would do it. I don't think that there's anyone that has the courage in the Republican Party to do it. I think on both sides, we now have created a class of elected officials who believe that they are celebrities, that they now have celebrity status. They're up there with Kim and Kanye. They're up there with Oprah Winfrey. They now are in this whole little bubble that can't be touched. But we, the taxpayers, should be throwing them out of office when they are not acting the way that we elected them to act, when they are not making decisions that are based on what the best decision and best policy is, and instead we celebrate them.
Yeah, my grandfather told me a long time ago, he said, every 8 years you throw the bums out, even if they're my bums.
Exactly.
Beautifully put.
My grandfather told me every 4 years.
Mayor, it's good to see you. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Thank you. Jim, thanks for your time. Appreciate it.